Hello, I'm Roger Congleton. This is Public Economics 441. And today we're talking about fiscal federalism, relationships between governments. This is the second lecture in that series. It's mini lecture 8B. So last time we talked about the TIBO model, the reason why competition between local governments can be efficiency enhancing. There are some exceptions to that rule, and we may talk about those in the next lecture. But today's lecture is focused on the effects of these subsidies that I mentioned early in that lecture between higher level governments and lower levels of government. So if we think about these subsidies, let me just first do the easy case. So let's suppose we're thinking about a taxpayer. And suppose this is the median voter's marginal benefit curve. And this is the median voter's marginal tax cost. All right, so I'm going to, like we've done in most cases, hold the tax system constant. That's not a silly assumption. If you look historically at tax systems, as I've said a couple of times, even though there's a huge number of little adjustments all the time, the basic outlines of taxes remain pretty constant for long periods of time. And the mix of revenues generated by those taxes is also surprisingly stable through time. So it's not that these are never adjusted, but they're adjusted very slowly in most cases, except for sometimes these partisan shifts that take place where rates will kind of go to the partisan norm for Republicans or to the partisan norm for Democrats, depending on who controls the Congress. And so in this case, we're thinking about a local government. And what we're doing, if we're just imagining some service level and this might be the quantity of public education, for example. So there are lots of public services in the country. Local public education tends to be one controlled by the lowest level of government, the local governments throughout the U.S. And in the old days, local governments relied mainly on property taxes for their revenues. And that's still basically the biggest revenue source for most localities. A few really big localities like New York City or San Francisco have their own income taxes and their own sales taxes. But those are somewhat unusual still in the country. And so I'm just going to deal with the case where initially we just have this one tax system, suppose it's real estate tax. And so we can think of the marginal cost of additional education as being extra real estate taxes that the median voter would have to pay if they expanded the size of the school system. So the median voter will have a service level like E star that would be the best for that person. Right, and of course that will vary among voters. It's not that the median voter is going to have the only view on this. There'll be people in the community that want more education. There'll be people in the community that want less education. But if we can rely on the strong form of the median voter theorem to base our kind of analysis on. It's not going to be perfect, but it's a pretty good first approximation. And the more competitive local elections are, or the more competitive the TIBO type forces are, the more likely it is that you wind up with something like a median voter outcome. This is not to say that interest groups don't matter. Teachers, for example, are often well organized. They have pretty good unions, and they're often pretty active in politics, lobbying for higher budgets for education. You might say, well, that's because they care about students. Well, that's probably true, but it's also true that higher budgets mean higher salaries for teachers and better working conditions. So the union is looking out for its members. It may, at the margin, also care about children, but it's not always obvious, it seems to me. Now, let's suppose that the state government decides to subsidize education. And there are various reasons they might want to do that that reflect, say differences in the local real estate tax base around the state. They may want to sort of equalize the opportunities of children throughout the state so that they all have a chance to go to a good school, not just the ones that are fortunate enough to live in communities with a lot of high-priced real estate. So if we impose a subsidy on this good, this diagram will look a lot like the ones we did when we were talking about subsidies. The subsidy will put a price wedge between the marginal cost of the service and the marginal benefit of the service. And in this case, there are not two prices really. It's just that in effect, the median voter is getting a discount, right? Getting it at a lower price. So you could think of the marginal tax cost as shifting down. But again, if local taxes aren't changed, then all that happens is the money comes in from outside the locality, from the state treasury to the local treasury. And probably you don't really need to think about that curve shifting. Just think of it again as a wedge that makes up the difference between this marginal tax cost and that marginal tax benefit. So they can go out and get this other education level because of the subsidy. And it's one that's greater than it would have been without the subsidy. So again, the intuition behind subsidies, if you subsidize something, you get more of it, holds up. And we haven't taken account of the entire market, so we haven't tried to develop the deadweight loss, if any, that might be associated with the subsidy. Or if it could be argued that there's some kind of positive externality in having everyone educated in the state, and it could be that some of this could look a little bit like a Bogovian subsidy in many cases. So I'm not trying to make a normative case here. I'm just trying to do the positive analysis. What happens if we subsidize education, using the state level tax base to send money back to the communities, but with it earmarked for education. And the short answer in this sort of diagram framework that we've been using throughout the course is that the median voter in the various communities that get these subsidies are going to vote in favor of more education. So it's pretty straightforward. How we draw it is a little bit straightforward in a sense. It's a little different than the other diagrams, but the same kind of logic holds up. There's going to be a difference between the amount that someone has to pay and the amount that they actually wind up paying. So the median voter is getting the service at the margin for this cost, and the rest of the cost is being made up by the subsidy from the state government. Now, in national political campaigns, you often get the feeling that the central government is taking over public education, but that's certainly not true. The federal government, even though it spends a non-trivial amount of money on education, it spends a really small fraction or it accounts for a really small fraction of all the education expenditures in the U.S. In K through 12. At the college level, the federal government is relatively more important, but it's relatively more important not because it sends money to the colleges directly to pay for students, but because it sends money indirectly by making it easier for students to borrow money and through research grants that make it that pay a non-trivial part of the faculty salaries at research institutions like WVU and other kind of large universities and throughout the country, so-called R1, Research 1 universities. So the next thing I think that we need to do is to think a little bit about subsidies and different kinds of subsidies and how they affect allocative decisions at the local government level. We're going to do a couple things here that are related to our earlier discussion of the advantages of lump sum subsidies. So we're going to use an indifference curve type of framework for this next couple of exercises. So this might be the quantity of public education, and this might be the quantity of roads, or police protection, or whatever you want to think about. And So again, we're going to use the median voter model, and we're going to take a look at the median voters' decision about how to allocate money. In this case, you get kind of a modeling trade-off. Right? So the best way to think about this wealth constraint, this budget line, is that this is the revenue from a given tax system. So we imagine the town having a pretty stable property tax and a system and tax rates on different kinds of properties in the system. And a median voter is just thinking, okay, well, how should I allocate that money? How is that money best spent between, in this case, public education and roads? So he or she makes a decision, and that's the allocation we would see if the strong form of the median voter model is operational in this town. So now suppose the state goes in and does a subsidy, similar to what we had before in the previous diagram. And we're going to suppose that the subsidy takes the form of what public finance people call a matching grant. So a matching grant is, okay, you pay $2 and I'll give you $1 more to spend on this service. So for every dollar you spend, I'll give you some fixed amount. And that amount could be fairly large or could be fairly small. It just depends on the matching rate. But notice the effect of this tax, or this subsidy, pardon me, is to change the relative price of public education relative to roads. Now you get the match on expenditures on public education, but you don't get it on roads. So it changes the slope of the budget line confronting the local government. And we're using the median voter as our kind of characterization of the median of the government, the local government's interests, for reasons related to our election models. So under this new system, education expenditures goes up, just like the other model said. But notice that it's very common in these kind of models for the other services to also go up because because money is fungible, as people say. So you have more money to spend overall. There are incentives to spend it on education. But you can also take some of the money that you would have taken your own tax revenues from and use that to repave a few highways or fix the local roads, fix some potholes or whatever. Right. So there's a kind of there are two effects of this this subsidy. There's a kind of what some people call an income effect, which allows you, which is the idea that you can reach more possibilities now because of this new budget line. And there's a substitution effect. Well, there's a slope of that curve tends to push you out along the dimension that's subsidized. And exactly what the mix is depends on the shapes of these indifference curve. You can have cases where you get a lot more of the education or a little less than I've got drawn here. But the basic intuition in most cases will look like this, that all these services will tend to be increased in the community. All right, and that's partly because of the price effect. Now, I'm not going to draw this diagram, but if you go back and revisit the notes on the subsidies, you know that a targeted subsidy, one that changes relative prices, is generally considered to be inferior in terms of increasing welfare to a lump sum subsidy, right? So coupons for Cheerios aren't worth as much as the dollar amount that you, if somebody just handed you the money and let you spend it as you wanted to. In most cases, you could reach a higher indifference curve with the lump sum than you could than from the equivalent amount of coupons for Cheerios. And that would be true in this case too. Right? So if you just wanted to increase the welfare of the median voter, you would give him what's called a block grant. Right? So a block grant and a lump sum grant are basically the same concept. With a block grant, you just hand the money to the community and you let them spend it more or less as they want to. And that will allow them to reach a little higher indifference curve for reasons in the geometry that we worked through in the subsidy section. I'm not going to repeat it here because I try to keep these mini lectures kind of short, and we've already covered it once, and it's pretty well done in both the notes for fiscal federalism and in the notes on subsidies. So the next thing I wanted to look at, something I didn't cover in the section on subsidies, and I said I would cover when I got to this part of the course, is a different type of grant. All right, so so I'm just repeating this. This is going to be quantity of public education. This is going to be the quantity of roads. And this is meant to be the same original R1 star, E1 star equilibrium. So what I want to do is look at conditional block grants. Okay, so one thing you might do instead of having a matching grant for education, you just might give the community some money and say, well, you've got to spend it on education. And just say, okay, here's $5,000 and it's got to come to us and you've got to spend it on education. Or here's $5 million and you've got to spend it on education. So now that changes the budget constraint, okay, in a manner that looks like a lump sum subsidy. But it doesn't change the slope. So what you get is a budget line that looks kind of like this. And I put more money into this one than the last one, so don't be surprised that the numbers are a bit higher. Or the increases are a bit higher. There are a couple of points that are relevant. One is that the new budget line is parallel to the original one, right? So there's no change in relative prices. On the other hand, there's an area up here that you would have been able to reach with a true block grant that you can't reach with the conditional block grant. So as long as the conditionality is not that important, it turns out that these conditional block grants look a lot like a lump sum grant. It's only if the community would want to be up in this green area, up in this range, would the conditionality matter. And in those cases, what you'd see is towns that are adopting combinations that are right at this kink. Right, this kink will be an attractor, a natural equilibrium, or best choice in the case where the community would actually want to be up here but can't get there because it's not allowed under the terms of the grant. So when you hear governments or government officials talk about shifting from a matching grant type of thing, program, to something that's more like a conditional block grant, and that can make people better off, well, it's for the same reasons as a lump sum grant. A lump sum subsidy tends to make people better off than under a kind of targeted marginal grant subsidy. So the geometry we go through in this case, just like the geometry where you compare a lump sum with a marginal subsidy, as we've done before. So once you see this, you get the idea that grants can be really complicated. Right? They can have matching components. They could have conditional block grant. or they can be unconditional block grants. They also can be conditional matches, right? So if you spend more than X dollars, then we will kick in and start paying extra for the amounts at the margin. Okay, in that case, you would run along the budget constraint, to the original budget constraint, down to some point where the matching would kick in, and then the slope would change, and that would generate another type of grant program, one that would tend to cause the grant, the match, to have a bigger effect on expenditures on the service being subsidized for less money than the other type of system. And I think I'll draw that one up, and then we'll talk just briefly about the possibilities for these grants, and that will end this lecture on intergovernmental subsidies. And I just basically want to illustrate that what a conditional matching grant looks like. So again, we have the same original situation. And the idea is that we have there's some kind of matching arrangement. You get some discount, some extra dollars for every unit of education you pay for larger than EG. Okay. In that case, you could have changed the slope again, just like the normal subsidy diagram. But here, that will kick in when you get to EG, and you'll get something that looks like that. So if that incentive effect from the new slope is strong enough, it can even cause other areas of the budget to shrink as money is attracted into this now relatively cheap service because of this conditional grant. So that doesn't have to happen, okay? But it would not be an uncommon event if the match is pretty high. So an example of that recently is the expansion of Medicaid under Obamacare. And this is an extreme case. Basically, the federal government said that, well, you have already got Medicaid in place, and we'll offer to pay 100%. You know, that's a very high match, right? For the rest of government services paid to relatively poor people in your state. Not as poor as the people who are currently covered, but the new guys who are, you know, more or less lower middle class, I suppose you could say, who would be eligible for Medicaid under the new rules. And it was interesting that most states, of course, took that. I mean, that's this effect, right? But it turns out that healthcare is really quite expensive, and the government the central government has only committed to pay the full cost for a certain number of years, after which the states will be paying part of the cost. And healthcare has been a really big absorber of state expenditures for the past 50 years. I guess it's about 50 years now, maybe a little bit less than that. But it's an area that has absorbed a lot of resources through time. It's one of the reasons states spend relatively less on higher education than they used to, say, when I went to school. And that would be this type of example, right, where the public ed would be healthcare, and where there is a match from the state to pay for Medicaid. And this other dimension could be everything else. It could be public education, it could be roads, it could be police protection, and things of that sort. In general, state budgets have gone up in the past 50 years, partly because of demands for services, but partly because the median voter, when given subsidized prices for a lot of services, naturally wants to take more of them, and is willing to pay a little bit more for those services because they're cheap in a sense, right? So if you have discounts on airfare, you might spend more money on airfare than you would otherwise have done, just because you can fly a lot more times, and you find that a useful way to get net benefits added to your life. So the point of this is that there are lots of intergovernmental grants these days. It turns out that state budgets now are, I think it's approximately a third paid for out of grants from the central government, whereas if you went back 50 years ago, the central government paid essentially zero to states. And also local governments are increasingly dependent on state resources coming down the pipeline, and that varies a bit by state. But again, these grants are really significant forms of revenue nowadays in a way that wasn't true 50 years ago, and certainly not before that. And that has had effects on the kinds of services that local governments provide for two reasons. There are these income effects of even block grants that tend to encourage additional expenditures on public sector goods. And then there are all these incentive effects generated by the various forms of matching grants and conditional matching grants that we see today. So next time what we're going to do is talk a little bit about cases where the TBO type of competition causes trouble, or where decentralization causes trouble. And that's because sometimes the regulations and taxes of one community imposes restrictions on others. We'll talk a little bit about those intergovernmental externalities next time. So with that, I'll see you soon, and we'll end this mini lecture on intergovernmental grants.